As he drove into Chaucer Crescent, Sergeant Lewis turned to speak to his passenger. "Not often you show much interest in things like this, sir." Morse shrugged. "I used to live near him, that's all." "Did you know him very well?" "I've never known anyone very well, Lewis, but he showed me his collection of cigarette cards once. Very fine." "Probably not got it any longer." "Probably not," admitted Morse. "Valuable?" "Oh, yes. No cigarette cards around these days, are there?" Lewis unfastened his safety belt. "I wouldn't know. I've never smoked myself." "Well, just don't be too critical of those who do," said Morse briskly as he stubbed out his cigarette. "Anyway, it's good for all of us to do a bit of fourth-grade clerical work occasionally. You know, licking stamps, that sort of thing." "I've never actually seen you licking stamps." "Lewis, I shall go crackers if you use that weasel word 'actually' much more." Sergeant Lewis took a deep breath, made no reply, got out of the car. Number 14 was an unremarkable semi-detached property. The unloved front lawn regularly patterned with daisies and plantain, and beside the front door a wonderfully unweeded clump of giant dandelions. In general, too, the house itself presented a somewhat unkempt appearance, except for the windows, which had recently been replaced. And it was through one of those replacement windows that Mrs. Agnes Price, living immediately opposite at number 11, had observed a man peering into the front ground floor living room. "I suppose we'd better go and have a word with the old girl," said Morse. What a stressful morning it had become for Mrs. Price. She knew that more often than not burglaries took place in the broad light of day rather than by torchlight in the small hours of the morning. But was the man she had seen a burglar, or at least a potential burglar? There was no way of knowing, really, was there? It was her responsibility, though, to keep an eye on things, because Mr. Robertson had left his keys with her, as he had left them for each of the past 7 years when he had gone off on his mid-August holidays to Morocco. And it was clear what she ought to do, because the police booklet was quite specific. "If you see anything at all suspicious, don't hesitate to ring us and ask to speak to your local crime prevention officer." She had hesitated, though, hesitated too long. But at least her biggest worry was over, the worry that she might be causing the police a lot of needless trouble and making herself look a fool into the bargain if it was all a false alarm. But it hadn't been a false alarm. The goldfish suddenly gave a flick of its tail and propelled itself upon another of its interminable orbits inside its bowl. And somewhere inside Mrs. Price, too, there was a flick of self-importance as she saw the two men get out of the police car and open her front gate. After all, this was the second visit from the police that morning. Pity she'd left things a bit before ringing, thought Lewis, but he made no mention of the fact, as he and Morse were seated in Mrs. Price's front room, where the elderly widow repeated the evidence she had given 3/4 of an hour earlier. The first thing she had noticed was that he was standing there, the man, on the grass in front of Mr. Robertson's front window, and sort of peering inside, with his right hand up to his eye, just like the Americans used to salute in the old wartime films. Morse smiled. Nicely put. Then he tried the side gate. Locked, though. So he'd come back to the front of the house, and after that, well, she thought he'd gone away. But he hadn't, because he was back again about 10 minutes later, when he'd gone up to the front door and waited there for a while and sort of listened. A lot of burglaries took place when properties were empty, didn't they? And she just hadn't known what to do. She had considered going over herself, but he might still have been there. That would have been silly, wouldn't it? Lewis nodded. "Much better to ring us like you did, Mrs. Price. That's what we're here for. Isn't it, sir?" But Morse made no reply, apparently unaware that he had been invited to corroborate his sergeant's assertion. So Mrs. Price continued. She had rung the police, and the young P.C. Watson had arrived within 10 minutes. They'd gone to number 14 together, where she'd let them both in. She had picked up the letters from the doormat and put them on the hall stand, but she hadn't touched anything else. Things seemed fairly normal downstairs, except for the French window, of course. Again Lewis nodded encouragingly. But upstairs, in poor Mr. Robertson's bedroom, oh dear. Would you recognize him again, the burglar? She shook her head. He had got his back to me most of the time. Was he white or coloured? White. Fair hair, dark hair? Darkish. Was it long or short? Oh, short. Shortish. And what was he wearing? I can't really. Was he just wearing a shirt? I mean, it's a lovely warm day. Yes, I think he was, just in his shirt sleeves. Can you remember what colour? A blue. A bluish, I think. How old would you say? A youngish. The ish suffix was figuring frequently in Lewis's notebook. A teenager? Oh, no, older than that. Was he carrying anything suspicious? You know what I mean, like, But Lewis seemed unable to provide any specific exemplification. I think he was carrying something, yes, but... Oh, that's fine. Don't worry, said Lewis, closing his notebook and getting to his feet. As Mrs. Price handed him the keys, he asked one final question. How long have you had the goldfish, by the way? You do ask some stupid questions, said Morse, as he and Lewis walked over to number 14. Was he just wearing a shirt, you said? If he was, he'd have been arrested for indecent exposure, wouldn't he? Mrs. Price knew exactly. And what's that goldfish got to do with anything? I was only... But Lewis abandoned any further explanation. What would you have asked? Me? For a start, I'd have asked him whether this was normally kept shut, said Morse, pushing open the decrepit wooden gate. Interesting things, gates. See this? He pointed to the notice lopsidedly nailed against the top bar. No free newspapers. So we may assume, Lewis, that our suspicious visitor was probably not the paper boy, unless he couldn't read, of course. Lewis shook his head. Even if he couldn't read, he'd still stick the paper through the letterbox, wouldn't he? So what's he doing looking through the window, sir? Ah, now that's a good question, said Morse, as he pressed the doorbell button, with no audible consequence, before inserting the key into the Yale lock. A dozen or so envelopes, brown and white, together with a few cards and leaflets, stood neatly stacked where Mrs. Price had left them, and Morse quickly fingered through the pile, a slight frown forming on his forehead as he did so. But there was no one to observe such temporary puzzlement, since Lewis had already walked through to the dining room at the rear of the house, where earlier Mrs. Price and P.C. Watson had quickly spotted the one, so far, incontrovertible piece of evidence of the burglar's intrusion, and pretty certainly his means of ingress. From the French window, which overlooked the semi-wilderness of the back garden, a small pane of glass had been carefully removed. The aperture thus created, though measuring only some few square inches, had clearly been sufficient for the burglar to insert a hand, to reach down, and to turn the dark brown key which now stood in the lock, and which, presumably, Robertson must have left there. Your old friend ought to be shot, ventured Lewis. Morse grunted agreement. The fingerprint boys will be pleased, though, sir? Waste of time, Lewis. We're dealing with a professional here. They're not all that bright, some of them. Lewis, you're missing the whole point. Which is? The glass. Where's the glass? Not in here, is it? Lewis looked down at the threadbare green carpet. Not a sliver of glass was to be seen, nor it appeared on the concreted area immediately outside. No, considered Morse. Somebody as organised as that isn't going to leave his signature around, and I wouldn't mind betting that he probably looked up after himself, too. He was reaching out towards the French window when Lewis laid a hand on his arm. Please don't touch anything, sir. Stop treating me like a child, snapped Morse. Considerably irked, Lewis followed his superior officer up the stairs, the passageway made even narrower by piles of books stacked at each side of every step. On the small landing, where the door of the front bedroom stood wide open, the two men came face to face straightway with a scene of chaos on a considerable scale. Bill Robertson returned from his holiday a week later. Clearly Morocco had a peculiar fascination for the tall, stooping 75-year-old bachelor, and his friends, as they studied his photographs of deserted beaches and empty restaurants, were regularly regaled with stories of the leisurely lifestyle to be had there. The best value holidays ever advertised. And now Robertson was home again. At 9 a.m. the Heathrow Customs had been ready for him, and on the coach journey back to Oxford he had sought to come to terms with the news that his property had been ransacked and that the police were anxious to be with him when he first set foot in number 14 again. "It doesn't seem too much wrong," he began tentatively, as together with Morse and Lewis he stood first in the hallway, then in the front room, and then in the dining room, where Lewis pointed to the French window, now liberally besprinkled with dusting powder. It was Robertson who broke the ensuing silence. "I'm so sorry. I really should have had it fixed before I went, shouldn't I?" "You mean to say," began Lewis slowly. Robertson nodded. "I was trying to get a bit of gardening done, and the hand of the rake, well, just sort of went straight through the window." "And you left the key in the lock," added Morse quietly. Robertson looked like a guilty schoolboy. "You know," said Lewis, "you might just as well have left a notice on the gate telling everybody that the back door was open." "Oh, you're right, but I'm still a bit surprised that everything's been left so tidy." Lewis walked to the foot of the stairs, wondering what his own immaculately methodical wife would have made of this man's idea of tidiness. "Just wait a little while, if you will, sir." "I'm in for a shock? Is that what you're telling me?" "I'm afraid so," said Lewis quietly. So many persons have experienced that traumatic jerk of anguish on first witnessing a burglar's depredations that it would be merciful to draw a veil over the scene which confronted Robertson as he stepped into his bedroom. Yet some description, however inadequate, must be attempted. All the drawers for the two large mahogany chests had been removed and lay, on their sides or upside down, alongside the single bed, forming, as it were, the basis of a pyramid, whose superstructure comprised, variously, piles of such things as bed linen, shirts, pyjamas, cardigans, phrase books, maps, paperbacks, diaries, the great motley heap littered at its apex with pens and pencils, bottle openers, tubes of ointment, and small denomination coinage, as if the contents of the various canisters and jars scattered around the room had been sprinkled over the entire accumulation. Robertson stood silent, and Lewis stood silent. And Morse himself, after easing his way past the wreckage, stood silent too, as he looked out over the quiet crescent, where a postman was working his way along the opposite side of the street. A youngish, darkish man, wearing a light bluish, short-sleeved shirt, for the morning was just as gloriously warm as it had been at the same time a week previously. And Morse smiled sadly, if contentedly, to himself, for all the clues now fitted into place. The light blue shirt, the malfunction of the front doorbell, the card he'd read in the stack of mail inviting the householder to collect a recorded delivery package, the missing pane in the French window, and, above all, the fecklessness of his former neighbour. "Take your time, sir," prompted the gentle Lewis, "and no need to say anything else for a while. Just have a quiet look around and try to tell us what's missing." Meanwhile, Morse had turned his back on the bedroom window, the replacement bedroom window. Apart from a first perfunctory greeting, he had said nothing, and still said nothing, although he now saw the whole thing so clearly. Perhaps given a minute or so longer, he would himself have revealed the extraordinary truth concerning the burglary of number 14 Chaucer Crescent. But he had no need, for quietly, sadly, Robertson did it for him, as he picked up a dog-eared Moroccan phrase book from the top of the pyramid. "You know, gentlemen, it's very difficult for me to tell you what's missing here, if anything, because this room looks to me exactly the same as when I went away.